Chapter 7. Overtures Toward a Dialogue. I had met Deng Xiaoping, now the paramount leader of China, several times during my visit to Beijing in 1954 to 1955, and knew that he was one of the senior Chinese figures who had been most involved in matters related to Tibet. In an overture to this new regime in China, in my official March 10th statement of 1978, I said, "If the 6 million Tibetans in Tibet are really happy and prosperous, as never before, there is no reason for us to argue otherwise. If the Tibetans are really happy, the Chinese should allow every interested foreigner to visit Tibet without restricting their movements or meetings with the Tibetan people. This would enable the visitors to really know the true conditions in Tibet. Furthermore, the Chinese should allow the Tibetans in Tibet to visit their parents and relatives now in exile. These Tibetans can then study the conditions of those of us in exile living in free countries. Similar opportunity should be given to the Tibetans in exile." Quite unexpectedly, at the end of 1978, my brother Gyalo Thondup, who was then living in Hong Kong, received an invitation to meet with Deng Xiaoping in Beijing. This was clearly an overture, and Gyalo Thondup consulted me about what to do. In November of that year, 34 members of my former government in Tibet were released from prison with great public ceremony. Clearly a hopeful message was being sent. On February 1st, 1979, the Panchen Lama made his first public appearance after 14 years and called for my return to Tibet. At the same time, the United States established formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, signaling the possibility for a fundamental shift taking place in China vis-à-vis the international community. I told my brother that he should accept the invitation, but at this stage to do so in a personal capacity rather than as my formal representative. On March 12, 1979, he met Deng Xiaoping in the Great Hall of the People. Deng opened the meeting by asking how my health was, and he asked how long it had been since my brother was last in Beijing. He answered that it was in 1949, 30 years ago. As their conversation progressed, Deng told my brother that complete independence of Tibet was non-negotiable. But except for independence, everything is negotiable. Everything can be discussed, he said. Deng was extraordinarily open and indeed positive about a series of questions Gyalo Thondup raised, even though my brother had made it clear that he was speaking in a personal capacity. Deng agreed to open up the border between Tibet and India, so family members who had been cut off for 2 decades could see each other. He accepted that we send from our exile community Tibetan language teachers into Tibetan areas, and even agreed to the opening of a liaison office in Beijing to begin the process of a conversation. Deng assured him that China's new leadership was committed to fundamental and lasting change, and if the Dalai Lama had doubts, then we should send people to investigate the situation inside Tibet. He said that it is better to see things with one's own eyes than hear something 100 times from other people. By the early 1970s, after careful and deep contemplation, I had come to some important realizations on the nature of our struggle and what might be the best means to move forward. One thing I realized was that if our side insisted on our goal of restoring Tibet's independence, this would mean the Tibetans might even have to consider the possibility of a prolonged armed struggle against communist China, which would be not just impractical, but in fact suicidal. I vividly remember what Prime Minister Nehru said about the unrealistic nature of our quest for restoring Tibet's independence. that the United States is not going to go to war with China for the sake of Tibet. Of course, as someone categorically opposed to violence, I could no longer lead the freedom movement if the Tibetan struggle were to choose violence as its path. Furthermore, I came to recognize that what mattered most to us Tibetans was the protection of a people with a unique language, culture, and religion, who are historically connected with the unique geography that is the Tibetan Plateau. Finally, there was the crucial understanding that to resolve the Tibetan issue, we would have to eventually sit down and talk with the Chinese. And for that, despite the historical truth of our independence and the Tibetan people's deep attachment to this ideal as well as their right, we recognized that to call for Tibet's independence would be a non-starter for the Chinese side. Now, if our problem was to be solved through a peaceful process of negotiation, this required us to take into account seriously the perspective of the Chinese side. I understood that what mattered most to the People's Republic of China was stability and territorial integrity, while on our part, what mattered most for us Tibetans was the ability to survive and thrive as a distinct people with our own unique language and cultural heritage. The seed was sown for what later came to be known as the Middle Way approach, seeking not independence but genuine autonomy within the framework of the People's Republic of China. So, even before we received the overture from Deng by 1974, I had shared my thoughts with a small circle of key leaders within our Tibetan community in exile. We discussed in a candid manner the pros and cons of continuing to seek the restoration of Tibet's independence versus the new perspective I had come to formulate. We also discussed and debated how and when we might bring this new approach to the broader Tibetan exile community, as well as to our international supporters. After a series of serious discussions, the key members of our exile administration, including the cabinet, were all on the same page as me. So when Gyalo Thondap brought the message from Deng that except for independence everything could be discussed, I was convinced that there was indeed a scope for a meaningful conversation within a framework acceptable to both sides. Deng was as good as his word, at least with respect to sending delegations to Tibet. Between August 1979 and June 1985, we were able to send 4 fact-finding missions to Tibet. Remarkably, the Chinese government agreed that they could visit all Tibetan areas, not just what the Chinese call the Tibet Autonomous Region. I don't know what impression the Chinese leadership expected from our delegation, or how they supposed the Tibetans inside Tibet would react to their presence. In fact, fearing that our delegates might be attacked physically by right-thinking local people, the Chinese authorities actually briefed the locals to show courtesy to the visiting delegates. When the 5 members of our first delegation, led by Juchen Thupten Namgyal, then a senior minister in my cabinet in Dharamsala, arrived in Amdo, my birthplace, they were mobbed in adulation by thousands of people, especially the young. This alarmed their Chinese minders, who signaled ahead to warn the authorities in Lhasa. The reply came back saying that people in Amdo and Kham were simple nomads without class consciousness. But thanks to the standard of Marxist training in the capital, there was no possibility of embarrassment there. Yet in Lhasa, the crowds were immense and ecstatic. One of the delegates overheard a senior Chinese cadre's remark, "The efforts of the last 20 years have been wasted in a single day." In fact, everywhere the delegates were mobbed by people crying and recounting the terrible tragedies they had suffered. There was a horrific litany of human rights abuses, and cultural destruction was graphically illustrated by many photographs of monasteries and nunneries reduced to rubble. Despite the Chinese leadership's evident surprise and embarrassment at the Tibetan reaction to our first delegation, I should acknowledge that it was magnanimous of Deng to allow the planned second, third, and fourth delegations to go ahead, although in the end, the second delegation, led by Tenzin Namgyal Tethong, at the time my representative at the Office of Tibet, New York, and consisting of young Tibetan leaders, was sent back early. The third delegation was led by Jetsun Pema, my younger sister, and the fourth led by the former senior Tibetan official Kundaling Woza Gyaltsen. Perhaps Beijing interpreted the outpouring of grief on the part of the Tibetans as an immediate expression of anguish at the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, rather than reflecting deeper feelings against communist Chinese occupation. What these visits demonstrated to us was the massive support within Tibet for the struggles we were undertaking for them in exile and my own leadership. One of the immediate results of our delegation visits was the unprecedented fact-finding mission of the new party secretary Hu Yaobang and Vice Premier Wan Li, who went to Lhasa in May 1980. They were dismayed by what they saw and subjected the local Chinese leadership to a severe dressing down. Hu declared, "We feel that our party has let the Tibetan people down. We feel very bad. The sole purpose of our Communist Party is to work for the happiness of the people, to do good things for them. We have worked for nearly 30 years, but the life of the Tibetan people has not notably improved. Are we not to blame?" Hu is said to have compared the situation in Tibet to colonialism. He announced a 6-point policy, including full rights for Tibetans to exercise regional autonomy, the development of Tibetan culture, language, and education in accord with socialist orientation, and an increase in the number of Tibetan officials. This new, more liberal policy led to the reappearance of individual religious practices, the reopening and rebuilding of monasteries, permission for new young monks, and reprinting of classical Tibetan texts in modern book format. The Communist Party made good on Deng's promise to my brother Gyalo Thondup, allowing both exiled Tibetans to return for visits and resident Tibetans to go abroad, especially to India, to meet their relatives. Among those able to leave Tibet in the early 1980s was Loponla, a senior monk at Namgyal Monastery in the Potala Palace complex, whose monks are traditionally responsible for assisting the Dalai Lama in rituals and official ceremonies. Following my departure from Lhasa in 1959, Loponla had spent 18 years in Chinese prisons. After he rejoined his old monastery, now re-established in Dharamsala, his tall and somewhat stooped posture became a recognizable presence. Since I had known Loponla in Tibet and liked him a lot, I met with him on many occasions. During one such meeting, when we were having tea together, he casually remarked that during his prison time, there were 2 or 3 occasions when he felt real danger, thinking that he was speaking of some kind of threat to his life. I asked, "What kind of danger?" He replied, "The danger of losing my compassion toward the Chinese." When I heard what he said, I just bowed to him. Later I learned of similar stories from other Tibetans, especially monks and nuns, who took extreme care not to lose sight of the humanity of the Chinese, even those who were inflicting such harm and hardship on them. In my efforts to deal directly with the Chinese leadership in the spirit of what Deng Xiaoping had said to my brother in 1979, I wrote a letter to Deng in March 1981. I expressed my appreciation of Hu Yaobang's trip to Tibet and his efforts to right the wrongs, and for frankly admitting past mistakes. I acknowledged the invitation through my brother that Deng and I should keep in contact with each other, and I thanked him for allowing us to send delegations to the Tibetan areas. I wrote, "If the Tibetan people's identity is preserved, and if they are genuinely happy, there is no reason to complain. However, in reality, over 90% of the Tibetans are suffering both mentally and physically and are living in deep sorrow. These sad conditions have not been brought about by natural disasters, but by human action. Therefore, genuine efforts must be made to resolve the problems in accordance with the existing realities in a reasonable way. In order to do this, we must improve the relationship between China and Tibet, as well as between Tibetans in and outside Tibet. With truth and equality as our foundation, we must try to develop friendship between Tibetans and Chinese through better understanding in the future. The time has come to apply our common wisdom in a spirit of tolerance and broad-mindedness to achieve genuine happiness for the Tibetan people with a sense of urgency." The Chinese response came swiftly through a private meeting between my brother Gyalo Tondup and Hu Yaobang in July 1981. Hu articulated a 5-point basis, according to which a rapprochement would be possible from the Chinese point of view. This was disappointing because the focus in that proposal was entirely on my personal position and my return to Tibet, rather than on the much bigger question of the well-being of the 6 million Tibetan people. Effectively, nothing of substance was on offer, and whatever Deng Xiaoping had said to my brother in 1979, it was clear, at least from this proposal, it was not true that, except for independence, everything was negotiable. In any case, following the opening of direct conversations with China, both formal and informal, and the opening up of China itself, as well as some opening in Tibet, it became clear that we were in a much more complex phase with respect to our advocacy for Tibet compared to before. Previously, our role was to bring attention to the crimes and destruction taking place and to make the case for freedom and human rights. Now we needed to bring substantive proposals from our side that might lead to a mutually acceptable agreement. So, in my official March 10th statement of 1981, I noted that past history had disappeared into the past, and what was more relevant was that in the future there actually must be real peace and happiness through developing friendly and meaningful relations between China and Tibet. For this to be realized, I said, it was important for both sides to work hard to have tolerant understanding and be open-minded. I decided to send a high-level delegation to Beijing, and in April 1982, my 3-member exploratory delegation, consisting of 2 of my Kalon S cabinet ministers, Yuchen Tupten and Phuntsok Tashi Takla, and the Speaker of our Assembly of Tibetan People's Deputies, Lodigyari, left for Beijing. They were briefed on my thoughts and ideas for a possible resolution. We were eager to find out if there had been a real shift in the Chinese Communist position and what Deng Xiaoping's statement, "Except for independence, everything is negotiable," meant in concrete terms. For example, one of our negotiators asked whether Tibetans, in view of our different race and history, should not have the same rights as the ones being offered by the People's Republic of China to Taiwan. He was told that Tibetans could not expect to get what they were willing to give to Taiwan, because Taiwan was, unlike Tibet, not yet liberated. When my exploratory delegation arrived in Beijing, however, the Chinese side was expecting a reply to the 5-point proposal Hu Yaobang had given to my brother during his visit. This led to some initial confusion. The members of my delegation and their Chinese counterparts were talking at cross purposes. The Chinese side then provided a copy of the proposal and shared the official transcript of my brother's meeting with Deng Xiaoping in 1979. In the end, the Chinese simply reiterated their position. Clearly, there was no space yet for a substantive conversation. That said, I was feeling quite positive about the changes taking place on the ground in Tibet. For example, at a formal Buddhist teaching in Bodh Gaya in 1983, hundreds of monks and laypeople from Tibet itself were able to come on a pilgrimage. As such, I publicly expressed my wish to visit Tibet, possibly in 2 years' time. I proposed to send an advance party to prepare for it, but unfortunately, they did not respond positively. In May 1984, we held a special meeting in Dharamsala, attended by my cabinet and representatives from the Assembly of Tibetan People's Deputies and other key constituencies, such as the Tibetan Women's Association and the Tibetan Youth Congress, to discuss my ongoing engagement with Beijing. And in October of that year, I sent the same exploratory delegation for further talks in Beijing. There, our delegation pointed out that the 5 points proposed by the Chinese government concerned only the status and return of the Dalai Lama. We reminded the Chinese that the issue was Tibet and its people, and the delegation again conveyed my wish to visit my home country. One substantive suggestion we made was the idea of a demilitarized Tibet, including Kham and Amdo, that would have internal autonomy within the People's Republic of China. The Chinese rejected any discussion of these proposals, denying that there was such a thing as the Tibetan issue, and claimed that the only matter to be discussed was the position of the Dalai Lama. They reiterated Hu Yaobang's 5 points of 1981, making them public for the first time, soon after my representatives returned to India from Beijing. After what seemed to be progress, we were again at an impasse.